evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Tavis Smiley's been on TV for a long time, but he had his show suspended last week by PBS after PBS says it received, quote, credible allegations of sexual misconduct. Smiley admits to having relationships with several of his employees at the company, but he says he's not a harasser. He's never groped or coerced anyone. He also says PBS never gave him the chance to respond to the anonymous allegations against him. Meanwhile, on CNN this weekend, former Obama spokesperson Jen Psaki said that all accusations of sexual misconduct should be presumed true without exception.
There are false accusations out there. It does happen. Even the most liberal, most progressive advocates for women against sexual violence concede that point. Is an accusation enough?
Yes, it is enough. I completely agree that in the time we're in right now, this is going to be perhaps a bloody period. But, I mean, the fact is that Democrats and the Democratic Party cannot be, here you have a waiver. We have zero tolerance, but.
That's the state of play. Tavis Smiley joins us tonight. Tavis, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tucker.
So what specifically did PBS accuse you of doing when they yanked your show off the air?
It's hard to know. The clause in my contract that they originally suggested to me they were looking into, this is sort of inside baseball. It's clause 5.1, which is the morals clause. We all have morals clauses in our contracts. The clause that they invoked when they pulled the plug on the show was clause 9.1, which is the clause that allows them simply to decide not to distribute my show anymore. In other words, they told me that they were suspending me under clause 9.1, but they told the press basically that I'd violated clause 5.1. So PBS to this very moment has not told me specifically what I am being suspended for.
So they issued a statement accusing you of some non-specific sex crime, in effect. You don't know what that is? You don't know who's accused you of this, and you don't know the substance of it?
I do not. PBS launched an investigation without telling me about it. I found out about it in the streets when former colleagues, Tucker, of mine, started calling me to tell me they were receiving strange phone calls, asking strange questions from some investigator, asking questions like, did Tavis ever make you feel uncomfortable? Are there other persons we should talk to? And so they started letting me know about these calls. That's how I learned of this. I contacted, of course, my attorneys. My attorneys reached out to PBS and these investigators, and for weeks, my attorneys offered for me to sit down at any time, place, or point to answer whatever questions they might have. They rejected that invitation for weeks, only under the threat of lawsuit. Our suing them, did they agree to finally sit with me for 3 hours and to talk to me. And in that 3-hour conversation, I was never told what the accusations were, who the accusers were. I was never allowed to provide any data or evidence to debunk anything that perhaps I could have debunked if I had known what we were talking about anyway. But they wouldn't allow me to present any evidence, and they, frankly, didn't give me due process. And on top of that, they have, to this moment, not talked to anyone on my current staff, not my COO, who was in charge of HR. It's mind-boggling to me that they've sort of kind of had played this game of pick and choose of who they actually want to talk to. And all these persons they've talked to are former employees, some of them who were terminated. I've been at this 30 years. When you're in business that long, you hire people, and some people get fired, but they won't talk to, for whatever reason, my current staff or the person in charge of HR to just ask very simply, did Tavis ever instruct you to make any workplace decision based upon his relationship status? The answer is no, but they won't even ask those questions.
So do you know where the original complaint came from, or even if there was an original? So you don't know how this started.
No.
You don't know who's making the accusations.
I don't know how it started.
You don't know what the accusations are.
No.
So what did you talk about for 3 hours with their lawyers?
A bunch of vague questions, sort of what if this, or might you have ever done this, or it was basically a bunch of what if scenarios. No specifics, no places, no times, no real data for 3 hours. It was the most frustrating thing ever. I mean, I'm a conversationalist, but it's tough to have a 3-hour conversation without knowing what you're really talking about.
What should the process have looked like, do you think?
I mean, I certainly understand. That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked, Tucker. I certainly understand in this moment why any network would be concerned about these kinds of allegations, and they ought to be looked into. My complaint is the way that PBS has gone about this, not even telling me that a complaint had been lodged against me, never telling me they were starting an investigation, refusing for weeks to even speak to me, again, not talking to my current staff. There are any number of things that could have been done here, and they've just bungled this. And as I said, they made a huge mistake. They've engaged in a sloppy investigation, and something needs to be done to fix this.
So you've said that you had romantic relationships with people who worked for you.
Over 30 years of being in this business, yes.
Over 30 years.
Yeah.
Is that against, well, first of all, is that a wise idea? And second, is it against the rules?
At worst, it is misjudgment. Over the years, I've learned. I've been at this, again, 30 years, and so there are things that I might have done 30 years ago that I might not do now, not because it's illegal or immoral or unethical, but just because it might represent bad judgment. As you know, I've written 2 books in my career talking about mistakes I've made and lessons I've learned along the way. So, of course, there are many things in my life that I've done in the past that I might not do today, but it does not rise to the level of this kind of public shame, this kind of public humiliation, this kind of wrongful termination, and this kind of personal destruction.
What do you think this is about? I mean, why did PBS do this, do you think?
Whenever something like this hits the media, there's always more to the story than meets the eye. And I don't want to say much more than that because my attorneys are hard at work. There's a lot more behind this. I did say earlier today that it's strange when you finally get this 3-hour meeting and within an hour and a half after that meeting ends, they pulled the plug on the show. Clearly, when we went into that 3-hour meeting, PBS had already made up its mind without having talked to me early on in the investigation process, without having talked to my current staff. They had made up their mind. And so about 90 minutes after this meeting ended, we got the letter that they was temporarily, or indefinitely, I should say, is the exact language, indefinitely suspending my program.
Right.
And 12 minutes after that, this exclusive story broke in Variety. So I asked, how does an exclusive story break 12 minutes after we were informed that the plug was being pulled? And in that story, there are quotes from unnamed sources, presumably inside of PBS. Persons close to the investigation is the phrase they use. They had enough time to research my background, so there's background material about me in the story. There are links they placed in the story. I assume an editor looked at this before it went online. But all that was done inside of 12 minutes. Now, you tell me whether or not there's an agenda here.
Yeah. Well, so do you think the rule ought to be that you're not allowed to date your subordinates? Should that be allowed?
I certainly understand that there are persons who believe that there is no such thing as a consensual relationship in the workplace. I hear that. I even respect that point of view. But there are other opinions on this. In my employee handbook, we do not encourage inter-office relationships, but we don't forbid it either, because I don't know how things are going to turn out in your life when you start hanging out with our company. I don't know who you're going to meet. And let's face it, nobody's working 40-hour weeks anymore. We're working 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. Where else are you going to meet people? And this business, our business itself, is full of people, producers and talk show hosts who met on the job. So clearly there are millions of Americans who met their spouse at work. So I just don't think I have the right to tell people who to date. The problem here is that we're starting to criminalize legitimate relationships between consenting adults, and that's a real problem for me. And if this can't be resolved some other way, and if this does, in fact, end up in court, millions of taxpayer dollars are going to be spent by PBS to defend itself, and I don't think the taxpayers want their money spent that way.
I've never agreed with you on very much, Tavis, but I have to say I agree with a lot of what you just said, and I appreciate your coming on tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tucker.
Last week, the fame-grubbing celebrity attorney Lisa Bloom was further disgraced, as if that were possible, by the revelation she sought to make payments to various women in exchange for accusing Donald Trump of sexual misconduct. That is, of course, embarrassing. It's grossly unethical. Could it also be illegal? Mark Fitzgibbons is an attorney and a fundraising law expert, and he joins us tonight. So, Mark, you've said that this may present a problem with the FEC. What would the problem be?
It's a potential problem. The FEC regulates campaigns spent to influence elections, and this appears to be clearly intended to influence an election. Now, that does not mean this falls within FEC regulation. For example, we don't want to discourage people from coming out before an election and saying a candidate for office committed some unlawful act. We don't want to discourage that by requiring reporting.
Right.
However, the amounts of money here, and it's ironic that the left is so adamantly against dark money. Here we have the left, presumably the left, engaging in use of dark money. It may be somebody other than associated with the left. It could be some Republican who didn't want Trump.
Or whatever. I mean, whatever. It was designed to affect an election outcome. Therefore, you think it would fall under that category?
Absolutely.
So leaving aside FEC questions, wouldn't the bar have something to say? I mean, all lawyers, of course, are members of the bar. this seems like unethical conduct. Why wouldn't the bar be taking this up?
I think this is unethical conduct. There are certain circumstances in which a lawyer may pay a fact witness. For example, if you need the fact witness to travel. Those are the exceptions to the rule against or prohibiting payment to fact witnesses. This goes beyond paying somebody to travel to appear and testify. This is a lot of money. This was proposed money from an undisclosed source to testify about allegations of unlawful conduct. I think Ms. Bloom has potential ethical problems with the Bar Association.
But they're going to do, I mean, they never do anything, do they, to police their, I mean, what's the point of having a bar? You never hear of any lawyer disciplined by the bar for lying, for example.
You're correct, Tucker, and the Bar Association may tend to protect its own a little bit too much. But I think this is a good example of a time when the Bar Association does need to step in, because if we are allowing lawyers to pay witnesses to testify about facts outside the rules that currently authorize it for a limited number of exceptions, then we're going to have chaos in society.
Well, how could you get to a just process if you're paying people?
That is correct. It tempts people to lie. If you're being paid to testify, it tempts people to lie.
You think?
I think.
It's unbelievable. Mark, thank you for that.
Thanks, Tucker.
Appreciate it. The Obama administration didn't just leave America's immigration laws unenforced. It may have deliberately enabled a drug smuggling ring run by terrorists. That actually happened. Details ahead. According to a lengthy and extensively reported new piece in Politico, the Obama administration deliberately and systematically undermined a major drug investigation by the DEA for the sake of preserving the Iran deal. The report describes how the DEA unraveled a billion-dollar cocaine and weapons smuggling ring organized by Hezbollah. That is, of course, a Lebanese Islamic group supported by the Iranian government. But instead of helping to bring down the ring, the DEA was blocked by the Justice Department and the State Department, both of which refused to press charges or help make arrests. The apparent goal of all of this? Improving relations with Iran preparatory to the deal. Peter Brooks is a senior fellow for national security affairs at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, and he joins us tonight. Peter, thanks for coming on.
Good to be with you.
So it sounds like, I mean, this piece is very long. Dozens of people are interviewed in it. And it sounds like they nailed it. The Obama administration prevented the DEA from basically doing anything about Hezbollah's drug and gun smuggling because they wanted to keep the Iran deal in place. Do you buy that?
It's certainly possible. In fact, it fits thematically into the Obama administration's general way of dealing with threats, and that is if we're nice to them, they'll be nice to us. So even though we had Iran in a terrible position with the sanctions, they let them out of they let them off on a number of ways on a nuclear deal, which is the same sort of thing. I mean, there were side deals. They remain a threshold nuclear state. We don't get answers on their nuclear program. No visits to their nuclear military sites. So this kind of fits along the same line. So I think it's very, very much plausible, and it's very troubling because Hezbollah is one of the world's most powerful terrorist organizations. I mean, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah has American blood on its hands, and I think we should have taken the opportunity to take it apart, because this money that they were using in the drug smuggling ring, drug trafficking ring, was being used for weapons, was being used to support their alliance with Iran. They're an ally of the Syrian regime of Assad. So, yeah, this is really troubling if it's actually true. Of course, I want to hear the other side as well, but
so here's the
report.
Let me just say the allegation is, by the way, that in the absence of enforcement, Hezbollah, working with the Zetas, the drug gang in Mexico, smuggled tons of cocaine into the United States and laundered hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. Here's the other side. This is an Obama administration official on background. Quote, "The world is a lot more complicated than viewed through the narrow lens of drug trafficking. You're not going to let the CIA rule the roost, but you're also not going to let the DEA do it either." Their point is, look, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And DEA's priorities weren't at the top of the list, but America got something out of this anyway in the end. Do you buy that?
A bad nuclear deal. That's what we got in the end, really, when you get down to the bottom line. It's possible. And that's why I think we need to hear the other side of the story. I mean, they're going to put a different case out there saying that there were other things we needed to think about to get Iran to the negotiating table, and we had to look aside of this. But my concerns is about Hezbollah. I mean, like I said, this is one of the world's most powerful terrorist organizations, has American blood on its hands. Remember the 1980s, the American embassy in Beirut, the Marine barracks in Beirut, the attack against the Israeli, the Jewish community center in Buenos Aires. They even arrested Hezbollah operatives here in the United States. I mean, this is a group that works hand in gloves with the Iranians. They're involved in Syria today. So I think it would have been more appropriate if this story is true to take apart this organization, because they are a danger to us, our allies, and friends and partners around the world.
So here's Catherine Bauer. She was a Treasury official in the Obama administration. This is written testimony to the House last February, and I'm quoting, "Under the Obama administration, these Hezbollah-related investigations were tamped down for fear of rocking the boat with Iran and jeopardizing the nuclear deal." It sounds like it was an all-hands-on-deck situation where everything was subordinate to getting this deal. Why was the Obama administration so focused on getting the Iran deal?
Well, they thought it was very important. I mean, we all thought it was very important. Like I said, we didn't get a good deal, but we also thought that stopping Iran from moving forward with its nuclear weapons program was critically important. So I think that's what they would argue, and I think they should have an opportunity to do that. This also may be something that Congress wants to look into. I mean, this is a very explosive report and should be very concerning as we go forward in terms of our dealings with Iran. Thankfully, it appears to me that the Trump administration is taking a very different view on this and putting more pressure on Iran and countering them wherever they can. If you counter Hezbollah, you counter Iran. And I don't think we're in a better place today with Iran than we were previously. I think things have actually gotten worse, considering what they've done in Syria, the Shiite crescent they're creating, the instability in Lebanon, what they're doing in Yemen, what they're doing in Iraq, Afghanistan. So I think we should take every opportunity we can to counter anybody who's an ally
well, especially
of Iran.
Dumping drugs. I mean, if more than 60,000 Americans died of drug ODs last year, it's not a small thing to know that your government wasn't doing anything to keep illegal drugs out of your country.
Yeah, I think that's critically important. They were also being sent around the world too. They were being around to Europe as well. It wasn't just the United States, but there's also this terrorism angle that I don't want it to overlook.
No, I agree with that. Peter Brooks, thank you.
Thank you.
Robert Mueller's investigation was just accused of improperly seizing thousands of emails from the Trump transition team. We'll break down the latest blow to the apparent legitimacy of that investigation next.
Live from America's News headquarters, I'm Trace Gallagher. 3 people are confirmed dead following an Amtrak train derailment in Washington state. 77 passengers and 7 crew members were on board the train when it skipped the tracks on a highway overpass near DuPont. 13 train cars fell onto the highway below. It is unclear if the dead were all on board the train. More than 100 people were also transported to the hospital for treatment. Vice President Mike Pence delaying his Mideast trip until early next year. This is the second time the trip is delayed as Congress tries to pass a sweeping tax reform. Republicans hold a narrow 52-48 majority in the Senate, and if Tuesday's expected vote is a close one, Vice President Pence might be called upon to cast the tie-breaking vote. Mr. Pence will now leave for the Middle East on January 14th. If news breaks out, we'll break in. I'm Trace Gallagher, now back to Tucker Carlson tonight.
The last couple of weeks have raised a number of legitimate questions about Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian collusion. A number of members of the investigative team over there have been exposed as intense Democratic partisans. Now, President Trump's lawyers have accused Mueller's team of improperly seizing transition emails without bothering to supply a warrant or even a subpoena. They just took them. Mark Stein is an author and columnist, and he joins us now to put this in perspective. Mark, can you just take things?
Well, apparently you can if you're a so-called independent counsel. I mean, I should come the unassimilated foreigner with you here, Tucker, and say that I don't think there should be a 2.5-month transition between governments, which is unique to the United States in the developed world. And it makes no difference anyway, because the Democrats in the Senate slow walk everything. So here we are a year later, and all the deputy assistant, assistant deputy undersecretaries at every every department are still all the Obama guys anyway. So if it's meant to give you time to staff the departments, it's a waste of time. But in this case, it's particularly relevant because the transition was used by the outgoing administration and the permanent bureaucracy to set up their destabilization of the incoming administration, the Trump administration. And I see no reason at all why a guy who is supposed to be investigating Russian interference in an election that took place on November the 8th should be able to seize effectively an incoming government's entire confidential communications between each other in the period after the election took place. That seems to me entirely unwarranted by Mueller.
You're aware that by saying that, you're putting this nation at risk. I was watching MSNBC this morning and learned that those who raise questions about the Mueller investigation are, this is almost a quote, inciting violence in the streets, delegitimizing the U.S. government, maybe precipitating a coup. I mean, do you feel uncomfortable with your criticism because it's wrong to criticize the government?
No, because it's Mueller and the whole independent counsel that is designed to delegitimize the institutions of government, starting with the president. By the way, while we're at it, Mueller is the last guy on the planet who should be an independent counsel because he's not independent of anything. He used to work for Paul Manafort's former law firm. He's connected with everybody. Ever since he was appointed, for the last 6 months, I've sat and watched Fox, and I watched MSNBC and watched CNN and all the others, and an endless parade of Beltway insiders saying, well, I've known Bob Mueller since 1972 and you couldn't find a straighter arrow. He's an Eagle Scout. And that's exactly why, whether or not that's true, that's exactly why he shouldn't be independent counsel. He's not independent. He's the insider's insider. But just to go back to that point about destabilizing everything here, Tucker, if you take MSNBC at their word that this guy is a straight shooter doing a credible job, for it to carry conviction, if you're going to investigate the guy who won the election according to the rules of the election, you better be seen to do it in as clean a way as possible. You don't do it by appointing psychologically weird people who think they're somehow top super secret agents who've been put on earth to save the Republic, like this Strzok guy. You don't do it by involving people whose wives work for Hillary Clinton's Oppo research team. You don't do it by hiring people who went to Hillary Clinton's non-victory party on November the 8th. Not everything that Mueller has done discredits his own reputation and discredits his own investigation.
So by my count, you've got 9 out of 15 investigators so far having donated to Democratic politicians, to the Clintons. Now, I've got pretty strong political views. Very strong. I talk about them every night on TV. I've never donated a single dollar to any politician because my views aren't strong enough to warrant a donation. So if you've got people who are so spun up about politics, they're giving money to specific candidates, investigating a guy on the other side, why shouldn't that at least raise the question, what the hell is going on?
Well, exactly, because look at it this way. Mueller can't win now. In fact, the country can't. The tragedy is that the country can't win. Let's say that Mueller finds Trump guilty of something. Half the country, the half of the country that voted for Trump, is going to say this is ridiculous. A bunch of people who were Hillary donors, who went to Hillary's parties, who worked for Hillary's Oppo research team, who were having Hillary fans who were having illicit affairs because they loved Hillary so much it turned them on so much. As you pointed out, those tweets and texts between Strzok and his lover. You know, it sounds like John le Carre rewritten by Teen Beat. It's completely preposterous. But the half of the country that voted for Trump won't accept a verdict against him. Likewise, the other half will not accept, if Mueller exonerates Trump, they'll say, oh, well, that's just because the Republicans demonized him and trashed him. Mueller's killed the whole point of this investigation.
You're exactly right. The whole point of independent counsel investigations is to reassure us it's on the level. Mark, thank you for that, as always.
Thanks a lot, Tucker. Sorry I got worked up about it.
I love it. Harvard University is this country's most impressive university. There's literally no chance you could have gotten in. But is it practicing racism? And does the school have racial quotas to keep Asians out? We'll talk to someone who has the numbers on that next. Harvard is America's oldest, richest, and most prestigious university. Super impressive people go there. It's not a power to be taken lightly, but a small group of activists is determined to go head-to-head with them. We sat down recently with Edward Bloom. He's the president of Students for Fair Admissions. They are suing Harvard for anti-Asian discrimination. Watch. Mr. Bloom, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
So Harvard intentionally controls the number of Asians who are admitted. That seems like the clearest if true, the clearest possible example of racial discrimination you can imagine.
It's racial discrimination, and it's a quota. The quota today is against Asians, much like the quota back in the 1920s and 30s was against Jews. In 1992, 19% of Harvard's incoming freshmen were Asian. In 2013, 18% were Asian. During this period of time, Tucker, the number of Asians applying to Harvard came close to doubling. Now, is this just a coincidence that every year from 92 through 2013, the numbers stay the same? That's not a coincidence.
Maybe they just didn't do well enough on the SAT.
Oh, I don't think so.
Oh.
I think studies have been done for the last 2 decades that show that Asian Americans score about 140 points higher than their white counterparts, 270 points higher than Hispanic applicants to Harvard and the Ivy League, and 450 points higher than African Americans.
So let's stop pretending this is real. Everybody knows it. Everyone with kids applying to college knows this is happening. There's really no debate about it. People involved in it will admit it after 2 drinks. And so why is this permitted to continue when it's so clearly racial discrimination and against the letter and the spirit of laws banning this kind of thing?
Well, 70% of Americans believe that a student's race or ethnicity should not be a consideration in college admissions. Sadly, there are 2 institutions that we're fighting against. Number one, college administrators and bureaucrats and admissions officers are wed to the idea that your race should be used to help you, or your race should be used to harm you in your admissions process. That's the big problem.
So
with the
why
academy.
is this different from the practices we rightly decry from, say, the 1950s, where institutions punished people and rewarded others on the basis of factors they couldn't control, like their race? Why is this different?
Well, it's not different. Racial preferences that favored whites back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was wrong.
Yeah.
Now racial preferences that favor African Americans and Hispanics, that's wrong as well. You cannot remedy past discrimination with new discrimination, and that's what colleges are doing.
But the argument is that nobody is hurt by this, but it sounds like you have numbers that show the opposite. So the question is, how can you get documents that prove intent here?
Well, this lawsuit against Harvard is now in its 3rd year. Harvard, by order of the court, had to turn over 6 years of admissions data to us. Our experts have analyzed that data. They've compiled a huge report that will be submitted to the court. And sooner or later, the American public will have these numbers that they can analyze themselves. And we think it will be incontrovertible that Harvard is discriminating against Asian Americans specifically.
And is Harvard denying it, just to be clear?
Yes. Yes.
They're saying this is not going, it's just accidental that the admissions rate for this one group is exactly the same, even though its population has doubled.
It's a coincidence that Harvard doesn't really put a thumb on the scales. They're weighing holistic admissions criteria, such as leadership abilities and sociability, much like they did with Jews back in the 1920s and 30s.
Mr. Bloom, good luck in your suit. And
Thank you,
keep us
Tucker.
posted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Whether Harvard currently has a quota system, and it does, or not, one visiting professor thinks it should. Education professor Carlson Bhopal argued in a recent blog post that elite universities should explicitly implement a quota system for all races as a way to fight white privilege. Jason Nichols is professor at the University of Maryland's Department of African American Studies, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
So the idea that elite universities ought to have a quota system, I think we just learned in the last segment, they do, Harvard does, but it's hard to know what it would achieve. So I just pulled this at random, but Harvard, for example, admits a higher percentage of African Americans than the population of the country. So the country is about 13% black. Harvard's incoming class is about 15%. So what would a quota system mean there?
So first of all, I refer you to two cases.
Okay.
Regent City University of California versus Bakke, 1978, and of course Gratz versus Bollinger, 2003.
Yes.
Both of those determined that racial quotas are illegal. So if you don't have a racial quota, I would say if you are absolutely certain that there is a racial quota at Harvard, which I don't think there is, I would say you should sue. But at the same time,
they're being sued, actually.
Yeah.
And we just interviewed the guy suing them.
But for a different reason. But at any rate, I would say that to talk just about quotas misses Dr. Bhopal's primary point, which is that we have a dearth of African American and Latino students at top flight universities. And as a matter of fact, the Brookings Institute just did a study where it was, they determined that 4% at flagship universities around the country are African American, whereas the college age population is 15% African American. So you can see that there is a gap there.
For sure.
And he's trying to say that something drastic needs to be done. I don't agree that necessarily that has to be quotas, or we have to go back to that, but something needs to be done.
Well, I actually agree with that. Something does need to be done.
Absolutely.
And part of the problem is that secondary schools, high schools, are terrible in black neighborhoods. Almost all of them, not all, but almost all, are terrible. And nobody ever says anything about it. And our solution is just to import immigrants to make up the difference. And I think that's a massive failure on the part of the country toward its African-American population. So, I mean, I agree with you completely. I just am very skeptical that setting quotas for African-Americans in college will help anybody on the south side of Chicago, for example, because you know that it won't. It's going to help the kids of affluent parents. And not the people who need it.
Well, let me tell you one thing that was done. Of course, you know, at the University of Texas, where they made it so that if you were in the top 10%,
correct,
you could get into the university. You got automatic admission into the University of Texas. And that actually made for a relatively diverse population at the University of Texas. And guess what? Right-wing people complained. They said it wasn't fair. I'm in the 11th percentile. And then to me, that says something about entitlement right there.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you could also make the case, I mean, not to argue Texas education policy with you, but I mean, high schools are very different. I mean, so, you know, the Highland Park High School is really hard, and other high schools in Texas are really easy, so it's not a one-to-one comparison. That's, I guess, the point. But look, the real point is that America is much more complicated demographically than it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago.
Sure.
So Nigerian immigrants, for example, make more on average, from Africa, make more on average than white Americans. That's a kind of outside the narrative that you're pushing, it seems to me.
Well, again, going back to just really quickly to fix one thing that you said about the University of Texas, is that their graduation rates rose. More people were graduating, which means that a lot of those kids from some of those schools that you say were terrible were actually very capable of matriculating at the University of Texas.
But I'm sure they are. That doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me at all. Look, I mean, there are a ton of smart kids in all neighborhoods. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, look, the truth is you can meddle with the admissions policies at elite universities all you want, and it doesn't change the core problems, which is, you know, the schools are terrible, the overwhelming majority of kids don't have a dad at home. I mean, these are not problems that are solved in an admissions office, but we ignore those problems and pretend that Harvard can fix them.
Well, I think absolutely there are social issues that we need to fix, but I still think at the same time we need to recruit students from all different backgrounds, because one of the things that's been proven in many different studies is that diversity actually helps all students. learning in a diverse environment, economically, racially, and ethnically, actually helps all students, and that includes affluent white students.
Good. Well, let's see if this, since you believe in diversity, does this number bother you? So the percentage of Americans who identify as white Protestants is about 30%. At Harvard, white Protestants make up about 17%, a little less than 17%. So they're dramatically underrepresented, far more underrepresented than black students at Harvard. Is that a cause for concern? Why wouldn't we care about that if we care about diversity?
So you are. I think we need to look up.
I'm using the rules that you set to ask you a sincere question.
Here's the question.
Should all groups benefit from diversity or just ones you like?
Are we saying that? Are you trying to tell me right now that white students are the minority?
I'm saying
affluent white students. So let's talk about.
No, I'm actually saying factually that the white Protestants of all income levels are dramatically underrepresented at Harvard. So if it's a concern that this group or that group is underrepresented, why wouldn't that be a concern? Because you don't like them?
Well, let's talk about universities nationwide.
Well, how about just Harvard?
You have plenty of. Why just talk about Harvard? We're talking about university education.
Because I happen to have the numbers right here. So just answer. Okay. Does it bother you that here you have?
I don't know because I don't believe. I don't believe that white Protestants are underrepresented. When I just gave you statistics from the Brookings Institute that says that blacks are underrepresented nationwide.
Absolutely. No, and I didn't.
And white Protestants.
I didn't contest that, but white Protestants are dramatically underrepresented at Harvard, the most prestigious college in America. And I'm just saying, if the goal is to make sure that each group is represented proportionally,
what historical issue has kept white Protestants out of Harvard University?
I don't know, but I'm just saying if each group has
so there is none, is what you're saying.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if the rule is that every group needs to be represented.
If you're not aware,
hold on. Does every group need to be represented proportionally or not, or just some?
I'm saying one of the things.
Tough question.
No, it's not a tough question. It's an easy question to answer.
Not every group needs to be represented proportionally. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that every group that has been underrepresented historically, and actually at present nationwide, that needs to be fixed.
The rules are more complicated than I realized. Professor, it's great to see you.
They are complicated.
Thank you. The Pentagon spent more than $20 million a year investigating UFOs. They may still be doing it. What did they find? That story's next. A piece in the New York Times over the weekend exposed a $22 million program in the Pentagon's budget. It's dedicated to searching for unidentified flying objects and investigating reported sightings of those. Brett Larson hosts Fox News Headlines on Sirius XM Channel 115, and he joins us tonight. So, Brett, this is kind of the Pentagon has been hidden from public view, searching for UFOs. What started this program?
Actually, it seems to be Harry Reid started it back when he was the majority leader in the Senate. He threw a couple $1 million towards the project, about $22 million. Not a big chunk of the defense budget. A little enough that it didn't go noticed until just recently. Now, they said they stopped it in 2012, but in that short amount of time, one of the things that we definitely saw this, the video that I believe is playing right there on the upper right corner of these two fighter pilots who see this unusual phenomenon that's flying around in front of them. And when you listen to these guys, you initially hear them say there's a whole bunch of them. And if you watch that little object in the middle of the screen, I mean, I'm an airplane enthusiast. That doesn't look like anything that I've ever seen before, unless there's some new kind of drone that can fly at 20,000 feet. But what's so cool about this, at least from my perspective, is that they are actually talking to military personnel, to pilots, to people who, through the years, historically, have had these unusual things happen to them, and they're taking down their information and following up on it. It's very similar to the Project Blue Book that the FBI did and stopped back in the late 60s.
Well, it sounds like two things. There are an awful lot of pilots, military pilots and commercial pilots, who've seen objects that appear to defy physics. And second, these sightings appear to be clustered around nuclear sites, either nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, submarines, or nuclear power reactors. Why is that?
Conspiracy theorists will tell you that the aliens are very interested in our nuclear capabilities. That may or may not be the case. I'm not going to dismiss anything that the conspiracy theorists people like to believe in or follow up on. It could also be, and this is another reason why they kept this division going, it could also be our enemies, and it could be technology that maybe they have, and that's something that they want to keep an eye on. They want to keep an eye on our nuclear-capable submarines. They want to keep an eye on our nuclear power plants. They're certainly of interest to a lot of groups of people.
Of course.
That's another reason why I think having something like this is important, because when we say an unidentified flying object, that doesn't necessarily mean that ET is coming or Alpha is going to walk off the ship or we're about to have our close encounter finally. It could very...
We will put it on at the end of the show at email. You can email me at thestory@foxnews.com. Have a great night, everybody. That's our story for tonight. Tucker's up next.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Tavis Smiley's been on TV for a long time, but he had his show suspended last week by PBS after PBS says it received, quote, credible allegations of sexual misconduct. Smiley admits to having relationships with several of his employees at the company, but he says he's not a harasser. He's never groped or coerced anyone. He also says PBS never gave him the chance to respond to the anonymous allegations against him. Meanwhile, on CNN this weekend, former Obama spokesperson Jen Psaki said that all accusations of sexual misconduct should be presumed true without exception.
There are false accusations out there. It does happen. Even the most liberal, most progressive advocates for women against sexual violence concede that point. Is an accusation enough?
Yes, it is enough. I completely agree that in the time we're in right now, this is going to be perhaps a bloody period. But, I mean, the fact is that Democrats and the Democratic Party cannot be, here you have a waiver. We have zero tolerance, but.
That's the state of play. Tavis Smiley joins us tonight. Tavis, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tucker.
So what specifically did PBS accuse you of doing when they yanked your show off the air?
It's hard to know. The clause in my contract that they originally suggested to me they were looking into, this is sort of inside baseball. It's clause 5.1, which is the morals clause. We all have morals clauses in our contracts. The clause that they invoked when they pulled the plug on the show was clause 9.1, which is the clause that allows them simply to decide not to distribute my show anymore. In other words, they told me that they were suspending me under clause 9.1, but they told the press basically that I'd violated clause 5.1. So PBS to this very moment has not told me specifically what I am being suspended for.
So they issued a statement accusing you of some non-specific sex crime, in effect. You don't know what that is? You don't know